Chapter 1. A Boy at Sea. John Newton was born on July 24, 1725, in Wapping, a small port town on the banks of the River Thames near London, England. He was an only child, so his mother Elizabeth devoted all her time to his care and instruction. She taught him to read and write, took him to church every Sunday, and helped him to read the Bible and memorize a catechism, a summary of Christian beliefs, and many portions of Scripture. Elizabeth and John were both naturally quiet and peaceful. He learned fast under her care, and when he was 4, he could already read well. His father, also named John, was a captain of merchant ships and travelled for much of the year. At home he was strict and showed little affection. "I was always in fear when before him," his son wrote later. Elizabeth had lofty dreams for her child. She wanted him to study in one of the best Christian seminaries in Scotland, where he could be trained as a pastor. Her health, however, was frail. By the spring of 1732, she was showing the symptoms of a deadly lung disease called tuberculosis. Sometimes rest and fresh air, especially by the ocean, helped people to recover. So Elizabeth went to stay with some friends from church, Mr. and Mrs. Catlett, in the naval base town of Chatham in the country of Kent. To spare her son the pain of seeing her so ill, she left him with other friends who attended their church. In spite of the Catletts' care, she died on July 11th of the same year. She was 27, and her son almost 7. Her husband was still at sea. Because in those days there were no telephones and emails, he did not hear the news until the following year when he returned home. Captain Newton spent some time in mourning and then decided to remarry. A little later, he sent young John to a boarding school in Stratford, about 8 miles northeast of London. A boarding school is a place where students live and study away from home. Soon, Captain Newton and his new wife had 3 children together and became busy with the little ones. Never again did John receive the personal attention his mother had given him. In time, he started to forget some of the things she had taught him. John's first teacher at school was even stricter than his father, and John didn't do well. With his second teacher, he rose to the top of his class in Latin, a language all students were supposed to learn at that time. In other subjects, however, he felt he was losing ground. In any case, he didn't stay in school long. When he turned 11, his father decided it was time for him to experience life at sea and took him on the first of many trips on his merchant ship. It was not an unusual decision. Back then, many sons followed in their father's footsteps from an early age. In spite of his father's watchful eye, John picked up many of the negative habits and bad language that were common with sailors. He didn't give up the religion he had learned from his mother, but kept wavering between sin and conscience. He went to church, but mostly to try to escape God's anger against the sins he kept committing with his friends. Twice, the fear of God became particularly real for him. Once, he fell from a horse and barely missed a sharp rock that would have certainly killed him. Another time, he was late for a boat trip, arriving just in time to see the boat capsize. Most of the passengers drowned. Each time, realizing he was not in the right state to meet his Maker, John repented of his ways and tried to do better. For 2 years, he spent much time in fasting, prayer, and Bible reading, but eventually gave up and became worse than before. The problem, he wrote later, was that he was motivated only by fear. Since he didn't understand God's loving grace, he felt gloomy, unsociable, and useless. In the meantime, Captain Newton continued to look for opportunities to give his son a successful career. Thanks to his friend Joseph Manisty, he was able to find him a good position in Jamaica, where John, who by then was 17, would be trained as manager of a sugar plantation. John was excited. Before leaving, John received an invitation from the Catletts, who had cared for his mother. At first he didn't want to go, but since he was in the area, he decided to stop at their house. The door was opened by their 13-year-old daughter Mary, commonly known as Polly. John was struck by her personality and looks. In fact, he liked her so much that he could not leave the Catletts' home. The few hours he had planned for his visit turned to days and finally weeks.